Chapter 1. Under a Sky of Strangers. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint promise of snowfall. The city below hummed with the distant murmur of life. But up here, on the rooftop of the old observatory, the world felt quieter, as if time had momentarily paused. Elliot exhaled, watching his breath dissolve into the cold night as he adjusted the settings on the antique brass telescope before him. He wasn't an astronomer yet, not officially at least, but the stars had always called to him in ways he couldn't quite explain. The observatory had been his sanctuary since he was 16, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world and lose himself in constellations older than time. But tonight wasn't just another evening spent with his beloved stars. It was February 14th, and that meant she would be here. He had never planned to meet Celeste, and yet, for the past 9 years, fate had conspired to bring them together in this very spot. The first time had been an accident, a chance encounter when she had wandered in during an impromptu citywide blackout, seeking a place to wait out the darkness. The second time, it had been coincidence. She'd been chasing a meteor shower, just like him. By the third time, they had started wondering if the universe was playing some elaborate game. By the fifth, they stopped questioning it altogether. It was their ritual now. One night, once a year. No names, no exchange numbers, no promises. Just a stolen evening beneath the stars. Elliot checked his watch. 10:42 p.m. She was late. A flicker of unease settled in his chest. Celeste was never late. Not in the 9 years since they had met. She was always there, waiting by the telescope with a mischievous smile and a new story to tell. Some years, she'd bring a bottle of wine, claiming they needed to toast to another year of their strange tradition. Other times, she'd gift him a small sketch, tiny, delicate drawings of the night they had spent together. He still had all of them, tucked away in a box in his apartment, as if proof that what they had shared was real. 11:08 p.m. Still no sign of her. The rooftop was empty save for him, the telescope, and the glowing city skyline. He shifted on his feet, trying to shake off the strange anxiety curling in his stomach. Maybe she got caught up. Maybe something had come up. Maybe this was the year the spell finally broke, and fate had decided their time was up. Elliot wasn't sure why the thought unsettled him so much. This had never been more than a tradition, a fleeting connection forged in stardust and moonlight. And yet, the idea of never seeing Celeste again made his chest tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. 11:25 p.m. The first flurries of snow began to fall. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He should go. This was foolish. He had spent years convincing himself that their yearly meetings didn't mean anything, that they were just two strangers bound by the gravitational pull of circumstance. But if that were true, why did the empty space beside him feel so profoundly wrong? Just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A small, folded piece of paper, wedged carefully against the base of the telescope. His heart pounded as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the crisp edges. Unfolding it, he saw only 4 words, scrawled in delicate, looping handwriting. "Find me, Elliot. Please." His breath caught. He read the words again and again, until they burned into his memory. His mind raced. How did she know his name? Why had she broken their rule? And more importantly, what had happened to Celeste? The first flakes of snow swirled around him, and in that moment, Elliot knew one thing with absolute certainty. This year, everything had changed. Chapter 2. The Rule of One Night. Elliot stared at the note in his trembling hands. The ink smudged slightly from where his fingertips had brushed against the paper. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. The words on the page pulsed in his mind like a heartbeat. "Find me, Elliot. Please." For 9 years, they had followed an unspoken rule. One night, No names, no promises, no looking beyond the observatory rooftop. Yet somehow, she had known his name, and now she was breaking their rule with a plea that sent a shiver down his spine. His first instinct was to question everything. How had she learned his name? Why was she asking for him to find her? Had something happened to her? The city stretched below him, glittering like a constellation of its own, but it suddenly felt too vast, too impossible to navigate without a single clue. And yet, Elliot knew with absolute certainty that he had to find her. Sliding the note into the pocket of his coat, he turned away from the telescope and made his way down the spiraling metal staircase that led to the ground floor of the observatory. The familiar creak of each step under his boots echoed in the silence. He had spent so many nights here staring at the universe, convinced that the mysteries of the cosmos were greater than anything on Earth. But tonight, there was no mystery greater than Celeste. Once outside, the city's glow swallowed him whole. The streets were quiet, the occasional car rolling past, its headlights casting long shadows. Where could she be? He had never asked where she lived, where she worked, or even what she did outside of these stolen nights. Their ritual had always existed outside of reality, just the two of them, an island in time. But now, reality was crashing in, demanding more. He retraced his steps through the city, searching for clues he wasn't even sure existed. His mind raced with possibilities. Had she left other messages? Had she always been leaving them, and he just never thought to look? His hands curled into fists as frustration gnawed at him. How was he supposed to find someone he barely knew? Then he remembered the paintings. Celeste had always given him small sketches after their nights together, tiny renderings of the stars, the telescope, and sometimes, the two of them in silhouette beneath the night sky. What if they held the answers? He quickened his pace, heading toward his apartment, his breath coming in quick bursts. When he arrived, he barely took off his coat before rummaging through the wooden box on his bookshelf. Sketch after sketch slipped through his fingers, each one a piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. And then, he found it, the most recent one, given to him exactly a year ago. It wasn't like the others. Instead of the stars or the observatory, it depicted a quiet street, lined with old-fashioned streetlights. And in the corner, almost hidden in the brushstrokes, was a sign. Moonlight Cafe. Elliot's heart pounded. Had she been trying to tell him something all along? He grabbed his keys and bolted out the door, his pulse thrumming with anticipation and fear. He didn't know what he would find at the Moonlight Cafe, or if she would even be there. But one thing was certain. Celeste had left him a trail of stars to follow, and he was about to chase them. Chapter 3. A Universe Between Us. The neon sign of Moonlight Cafe flickered against the damp pavement, casting a soft glow that shimmered in the lingering mist of the city night. Elliot stood across the street, his breath uneven, watching the entrance as if Celeste might walk out at any moment. His fingers curled around the note in his pocket, its edges crumpled from being read too many times in the last hour. "Find me, Elliot. Please." A plea. A break in their unspoken rule. A shift in the universe he thought he understood. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few late-night patrons nursing their coffee, lost in their own worlds. The air smelled of roasted beans and something sweet, like vanilla and cinnamon. He stepped inside, scanning the space, his pulse quickening when his eyes landed on a small painting hanging by the counter. It was one of Celeste's. Elliot knew her style instantly. The delicate strokes, the dreamlike quality of colors bleeding into one another. The painting was a city skyline at dusk, but hidden in the swirling shades of blue and gold was the observatory. Their observatory. His heart thudded against his ribs. "Can I help you?" A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. Behind the counter stood a woman with dark eyes and a knowing smile, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She studied him with quiet amusement, as if she had been expecting him. "That painting," Elliot said, his voice rough from the cold. "Who brought it here?" The woman tilted her head, considering him. "A girl. She comes in sometimes, leaves paintings for me to hang. Never asks for money. Just says they belong here." His chest tightened. "Do you know her name?" She shook her head. "No name. Just a habit of showing up when you least expect her." That sounded like Celeste. Elliot exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "Do you know where I can find her?" The woman gave him a curious look before reaching under the counter and pulling out a small, folded envelope. "She left this here a few days ago. Told me to give it to someone who asked about her paintings." His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. His name was scrawled across the front in the same delicate handwriting as the note he'd found at the observatory. He hesitated only a moment before unfolding it. "Elliot, I know this isn't how we do things. I know we were never supposed to chase after each other. But things are different now. I can't stay in the shadows anymore. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I'll be waiting where we first met. Celeste." A chill ran through him. Where they first met. The night of the blackout. The old bookshop. Without another word, Elliot turned and pushed through the cafe doors, the bell above them jingling in protest. The city stretched before him, vast and unknowable, but for the first time, he felt as though he had a map, and Celeste was waiting at the end of it. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Dark. Elliot's footsteps echoed against the empty pavement as he made his way toward the old bookshop, his pulse hammering like a relentless drum. The city around him seemed to shrink, the lights blurring into indistinct shapes as the only thing that mattered was the place where it had all begun. The blackout. The first night he met Celeste. The night the universe had aligned just right to bring them together. The bookshop still stood on the quiet corner of Waverly and 10th, its large bay windows displaying a few scattered novels, their pages yellowed with time. A faint glow from inside illuminated the words "The Hollow Moon Bookstore" in elegant, faded gold letters. It was past closing hours, but the door, to his surprise, was slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, the soft chime of an old brass bell announcing his arrival. The air inside smelled of parchment and ink, warm and familiar, like stepping into a memory he didn't realize he had been holding onto for years. A single lamp glowed at the back of the store, casting a pool of light over a well-worn wooden table. And there, sitting at its edge, was Celeste. Her head was bent over an open book, her fingers tracing invisible lines across the pages as if searching for something only she could see. The moment the door creaked behind him, she looked up. Time slowed. He had spent the past 9 years knowing her in fragments. One night a year, stolen hours beneath the stars. And yet, standing here now, he realized he had never truly seen her in the light. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, her dark eyes carrying something heavy beneath their usual mischief. There was no smile, no teasing remark, only quiet recognition. "Elliot," she breathed, closing the book softly. "You came. You asked me to find you," he replied, stepping closer. "I couldn't ignore that. Not this time." Celeste's lips pressed together, as if she were gathering words that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Finally, she exhaled. "There's something I have to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Elliot waited, his heart pounding in anticipation. "Then tell me." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the book she had been reading. "The reason I only ever see you once a year. It's not just a coincidence. It's not just our rule. There's more to it." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Celeste reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I left the note at the observatory because I knew it was time. But I was scared, Elliot. Scared that telling you the truth would change everything. He took the paper from her, his fingers brushing against hers. As he unfolded it, his breath caught. The words written there were not new. They were old, dated, and in his own handwriting. February 14th, 2015. Celeste, if fate ever brings you back here, know that I am waiting. His vision blurred as he looked up at her. I don't understand. I don't remember writing this. Celeste swallowed hard. Because you didn't. Not in this life. The air between them felt electric, charged with something beyond understanding. Elliot's mind reeled, 1,000 questions flooding his thoughts, but only one escaped his lips. Who are you, Celeste? She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm someone you loved. In another lifetime. Chapter 5. When Stars Forget to Shine. Elliot stood frozen, Celeste's words reverberating in his mind like a distant echo from a dream he couldn't quite grasp. Another lifetime? The very idea sent a shiver down his spine, twisting through the logic he had always clung to. That doesn't make any sense, he finally murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. How could you know something like that? Celeste hesitated, looking down at the book still open on the table. The golden lamplight caught the edges of its pages, revealing sketches and notes in elegant, looping script. Because, she whispered, I remember. Elliot swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Remember what? She lifted her gaze to meet his, and in her eyes, he saw something haunting, something far too deep for explanation. Everything, she said softly. Every lifetime. Every time I've ever met you. Every time we've ever been torn apart. He wanted to call it impossible. A fantasy. A desperate lie. But something inside him, something deeper than reason, urged him to listen. Celeste reached for the book and turned it toward him. This, she said, pointing to a sketch on the page, is the first time we met. Not at the observatory, not at the blackout. It was here, in this bookshop. But it wasn't this life, Elliot. It was 100 years ago. He stared down at the drawing. It depicted a man and a woman standing beneath the same brass bell that had chimed when he entered. The man had his hand outstretched, a book balanced in his palm, while the woman, Celeste, reached for it, her eyes alight with something unspoken. The signature in the corner made his breath catch. E.W., 1923. His initials. His fingers grazed the aged paper, something heavy pressing against his chest. How do you expect me to believe this? He asked, his voice strained. Celeste sighed, leaning back against the wooden chair. Because some part of you already does. Have you ever felt it, Elliot? A moment of recognition when you saw me, even before we spoke? Like déjà vu, but stronger? Like you were remembering something just out of reach? He wanted to deny it, to shake his head and walk away. But flashes of their nights at the observatory flickered through his mind. The way he had felt drawn to her, even from the first night. The way their meetings had felt less like choices and more like inevitabilities. He exhaled, shaking his head. If this is true, if we've lived through this before, then why don't I remember? Why is it only you? Celeste's expression darkened, sadness creeping into the edges of her smile. Because, she whispered, you never do. A silence stretched between them, thick with meaning. Outside, the city hummed on, oblivious to the cosmic truth unraveling in the quiet bookshop. Elliot dragged a hand through his hair, trying to steady the storm raging inside him. What happens next? He asked finally, a reluctant acceptance laced in his words. Celeste's lips parted as she looked past him, as if seeing something he could not. That's what I'm afraid of, she admitted. Because this time, something is different, and I don't know why. Chapter 6. The Year Without You. The silence between them stretched, fragile and electric, as Elliot tried to grasp the weight of Celeste's words. The bookshop, with its shelves of forgotten stories and dust-laden corners, felt like a sanctuary, shielding them from the chaos of the outside world. But inside him, there was no sanctuary, only a storm, building and relentless. Elliot exhaled sharply. "What do you mean? This time is different." Celeste hesitated, fingers ghosting over the book in front of her as though she could pull the answer from its pages. "Every lifetime, it happens the same way. We find each other, but we never get to stay. I remember, and you don't. I search for you, and when I find you, fate pulls us apart before you can remember, before you can believe." Elliot swallowed hard, unease curling in his stomach. "And this time?" Celeste looked up at him, her gaze filled with something both luminous and heartbreaking. "This time, you came looking for me. That's never happened before." The words landed heavy between them, shifting the axis of everything Elliot thought he knew. He wanted to deny it, to chalk it up to coincidence or some subconscious pull, but deep down, he couldn't. Because the truth was, Celeste had always been there, lingering in the periphery of his thoughts even when they were apart. A whisper at the back of his mind, a gravitational force he never understood until now. He dragged a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name. "So what does that mean? That I'm finally breaking whatever cycle this is?" Celeste shook her head slowly. "I don't know. That's what scares me. If we change the pattern, if we step outside the script that fate has written for us, I don't know what comes next." A gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shiver down Elliot's spine. He couldn't explain why, but a strange, nameless dread coiled in his chest, like something unseen was watching, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Celeste seemed to feel it too. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was barely there, yet it sent a current through his skin, an energy that felt both foreign and familiar. "Elliot, whatever happens next, we can't run from it. If we have a chance to break this cycle, we have to take it. Even if we don't know what's waiting for us on the other side." He stared at their hands, at the way her touch sent warmth spreading through him despite the cold weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. A choice lay before him, one that felt as impossible as it was inevitable. He could walk away. He could dismiss all of this as fantasy, as a dream spun from moonlight and long-forgotten stories. He could leave now, before he fell too far into a reality he couldn't explain. Or he could stay. He could step into the unknown with her, chase the truth through the dark, no matter where it led. Elliot inhaled, his decision settling deep in his bones. He looked up, meeting Celeste's waiting gaze. "Then let's find out what's next," he said. Chapter 7. A Trail of Hidden Paintings. The night air was crisp as Elliot and Celeste stepped out of the bookshop, their breaths forming fleeting clouds in the dim glow of the streetlights. The world felt unnervingly quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. Elliot's mind raced, replaying Celeste's words over and over. If fate had woven them together across lifetimes, then what was stopping them from rewriting their story this time? But a part of him, the part that had always relied on logic, still fought against the idea. Celeste must have sensed his uncertainty, because she slipped her hand into his, anchoring him in the moment. "We need to go somewhere," she said softly. "Where?" "The observatory." Elliot frowned. "Why there?" "Because that's where it always begins, and where it always ends." The weight of her words sent a chill down his spine, but he nodded. "Then let's go." The drive up to the observatory was silent, both of them lost in thought. The winding roads, familiar yet unfamiliar, stretched before them like a path through time itself. When they arrived, the place was empty, the city sprawling below them in a sea of flickering lights. Celeste led the way, stepping onto the platform where a telescope stood, angled toward the heavens. She ran her fingers over the cold metal, her expression distant. "I used to think the stars held all the answers," she murmured. "That if I just looked hard enough, I'd find the truth." Elliot stood beside her, following her gaze. "And did you?" She turned to him, her eyes shadowed with something unreadable. "Not until I met you." His breath caught, but before he could respond, a sudden gust of wind howled through the air, rustling the trees. The observatory lights flickered once, then went dark. Celeste tensed. "It's starting." Elliot felt his pulse quicken. "What is?" She turned to him, her fingers tightening around his wrist. "The moment where we either break the cycle or lose each other all over again." A shadow moved across the sky, a brief flicker of something vast and unexplainable. The stars seemed to pulse, growing impossibly bright before dimming once more. And in that instant, Elliot felt it, a force pulling at the edges of his consciousness, unraveling the barriers between memory and reality. He staggered, his vision blurring, and suddenly, he was elsewhere. A memory, a past life, a place he had been before but never remembered. Celeste's voice reached him through the haze, distant yet urgent. "Elliot, you have to fight it." He tried to move, but the past was pulling him under, whispering secrets he wasn't ready to hear. And then, everything went black. Chapter 8: Constellations of Clues. The air was still, a heavy silence hanging over the city like a waiting storm. Amelia stood by the window, her gaze drifting over the darkened streets below. The rain, which had started as a gentle patter, now fell in torrents, drenching the sidewalks and blurring the city lights into soft orbs of color. She had always found something strangely beautiful in the quiet of a storm. It was as if the world paused, holding its breath in anticipation of something that might never come. But tonight, it wasn't just the storm that held her captive. It had been weeks since she'd last seen Lucas. Weeks that felt like years, stretching and twisting into an endless expanse of time. They had spoken only sporadically since the night at the park, their words thin and scattered, as though they were both afraid to reach out too much. Amelia had tried to ignore the gnawing ache in her chest, the yearning for him that seemed to grow with every passing day. But life, with all its distractions and demands, had kept her from spiraling into that longing. Until now, she thought about what had brought her to this point. How they had met, the friendship they had built, and how easily it had turned into something more, something unspoken but undeniable. The night at the park was the moment everything had shifted. She could still remember the feel of his hands on her shoulders, the way his touch had sparked a warmth that spread through her, making everything feel so right. But that moment was quickly overshadowed by the uncertainty that followed. Neither of them had dared to fully embrace what had been unfolding between them, and now, it seemed as though they had drifted apart, the distance between them widening with every word they left unsaid. The storm raged on outside, and Amelia found herself wishing, once again, that she could somehow step into that world of rain and wind, to escape this weight on her chest, to leave the confusion and the longing behind. But even as she wished for it, she knew it wasn't that simple. Life had a way of pushing you to the edge, making you confront the things you wanted to avoid most. She turned from the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she moved away from it. Her apartment felt smaller tonight, more suffocating. The silence was deafening, and the loneliness she had carefully managed to avoid now seemed impossible to escape. Just then, her phone buzzed, the sound jarring in the stillness. Amelia glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw his name. Lucas. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had no idea what to expect. What could he possibly want after everything that had happened? And yet, a part of her, the part she had tried so hard to ignore, urged her to answer. Taking a deep breath, She tapped the screen. Hey. The words felt strange, inadequate even, but it was a start. His response came quickly, almost too quickly. I've been thinking about you. Amelia's chest tightened, and she couldn't help the flutter of hope that surged within her. She hadn't expected him to say that. Not after everything. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to find the right words to respond. How do you reply to something like that when you're not sure what it means? I've been thinking about you too, she typed, her heart pounding in her ears. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then another message appeared. Can we talk? Amelia stared at the screen, her mind racing. Of course they could talk. But what would they say? What could they say? She knew the conversation wasn't going to be easy. It never was with Lucas. There was too much left unsaid, too much history, and too many emotions tangled between them. But despite all the uncertainty, despite the fear and hesitation, she knew that this moment, this conversation, was necessary. They had to face what was hanging between them, or they would continue to drift, always wondering what might have been. Where? She replied, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed send. Another pause, and then, meet me at the park. The one where we first met. The simple message sent a rush of memories flooding back, of laughter and shared secrets, of the way their lives had intersected in such an unexpected, magical way. The park. Of course. It was fitting, in a way. It was where everything had begun, and perhaps it was where they could finally come to terms with where they were now. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood there, phone in hand, the weight of the decision settling over her. The rain continued to beat against the window, but it felt somehow distant, as though it were happening in another world entirely. For a moment, she wondered if she should just ignore the message, let it go unanswered. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. She couldn't ignore what was between them. Not anymore. Without another thought, she typed her response. I'll be there. And with that, she turned off the phone, gathering the pieces of her heart and preparing herself for whatever this encounter would bring. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her. An uncertainty, a yearning, a question of what would happen when they finally came face to face again. Would they find the answers they were searching for, or would they realize that the distance between them was insurmountable? But as she grabbed her jacket and stepped out the door into the wet night, one thing became clear. No matter how much they had tried to avoid it, this moment was inevitable. Chapter 9. The Man Who Chased Fate. The park was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of children's laughter and distant chatter replaced by the rhythmic pulse of rain on the grass. The path, once lined with vibrant blooms in every hue, now appeared dark and muted, drenched under the heavy downpour. The trees loomed above her like silent witnesses, their branches swaying in the wind, a constant reminder of the passage of time. Amelia's footsteps were soft against the wet ground as she walked toward the old oak tree where she and Lucas had met years ago. She had never imagined that she would be here again, at this exact spot, under these circumstances. It felt as though the world had folded in on itself, collapsing all the years and all the emotions into one single, heavy moment. Her heart thudded in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation swelling within her. She wasn't sure what she was expecting tonight, what answers she was hoping for. Maybe she was looking for closure, or maybe she was simply searching for the familiar, the comfort of knowing that Lucas still had a place in her life. After everything, the years apart, the pain, the silence, it seemed like too much to hold on to. Yet, deep down, a part of her couldn't let go, no matter how hard she tried. As she neared the tree, she spotted him. Lucas stood there, just beneath the canopy of leaves, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his face shadowed by the dim light of a nearby lamppost. His usual confident posture seemed diminished, as if the weight of the past had worn him down. He looked different, more subdued, more fragile than she remembered. His eyes, though, were the same. They held that familiar warmth, the same spark she had fallen for all those years ago. For a moment, neither of them moved. Amelia stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or to turn and leave. It was as if the distance between them, both physical and emotional, had stretched to an impossible length. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, she stepped forward. Her shoes sank slightly into the soft, damp earth with each step, but the world around her seemed to blur until all she could focus on was him. He saw her coming and, for the first time in a long while, his expression softened. A slight smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but it was faint, as if he wasn't sure whether he had the right to smile at all. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice low and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze flickering to the ground for a brief moment before meeting his eyes. The words she had rehearsed in her mind before arriving all seemed to vanish now, leaving her with a hollow ache in her chest. "Lucas," she finally said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "It's been a long time." He nodded, shifting slightly from foot to foot, his hands still buried in his coat pockets. "Yeah, it has." There was a pause between them, the silence stretching longer than either of them seemed to want. Amelia's mind raced, trying to find the right way to say everything that had been left unsaid for so long. But how could she? How could anyone put all the years of pain and regret into a single conversation? "I wasn't sure you would come," he said, breaking the silence, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I didn't expect you to, after everything." She swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. She had wondered the same thing, had considered not coming at all. But the truth was, she couldn't stay away. Not when some thread of connection, still tied her to him. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed to see you. I needed to know where we stood." He nodded again, his expression unreadable. "I understand. I'm sorry for everything, Amelia. I'm sorry for what happened between us, for hurting you." The sincerity in his words took her off guard, making her heart ache all the more. She had never truly expected an apology, not one that felt real. But there it was, hanging in the air between them. "I don't know what to say to that," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can forgive you." His gaze dropped to the ground, the weight of her words settling over him. For a long moment, they stood there in the rain, neither of them moving. The world around them seemed to pause, holding its breath, just as it had that night they first met. Finally, Lucas looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, pleading with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. I wanted you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you. About us." Her chest tightened at his words, and for the first time, she realized just how much she had missed him. She had tried to bury those feelings, to convince herself that moving on was the only choice. But standing here now, with the rain falling softly around them, it felt impossible to ignore the truth that had always lingered beneath the surface. "I've never stopped thinking about you either," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There it was, the confession that had been buried deep within her, hidden for years. The one thing she had never been able to say, even to herself. The truth that, no matter how much time had passed, no matter the hurt, she had always carried him with her. Lucas took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The space between them was filled with a magnetic pull, one that neither of them seemed able to resist. "I don't know where we go from here," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "But I don't want to lose you again." Amelia felt her heart race. the storm inside her intensifying with every beat. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if they could ever return to what they once had. But as she looked into his eyes, something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. "I don't want to lose you either," she replied, her voice trembling. And in that moment, beneath the broken sky, they both understood that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Chapter 10. A Love Letter in Starlight. The rain had subsided by the time they left the park, but the air was still thick with the lingering tension between them. The streets, now slick with water, glistened under the pale glow of the streetlights, reflecting the world back at them in fractured shards of light. Amelia's footsteps echoed as they walked side by side, the distance between them not as great as it had been before, but still heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Neither of them had said much since the park, both seemingly lost in the aftermath of their conversation. It was as if the world had returned to its normal rhythm, yet everything felt different. There was an ache in her chest that wouldn't go away, a mix of longing and uncertainty that gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. "Where do we go from here?" Amelia finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Her words hung in the air like a question neither of them was sure they were ready to answer. It was a simple question, but it carried so much weight. Lucas walked a little ahead, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his gaze directed at the ground. His breath was shallow, his steps slow and deliberate. It was clear that he, too, was grappling with the enormity of what had just transpired. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "I wish I had an answer for you. I wish I could make it all right." Amelia swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She had always been someone who sought closure, who needed to understand everything before moving forward. But now, standing beside Lucas, she realized that some things, some relationships, couldn't be neatly tied up in a bow. They were messy, complicated, and uncertain. "I've been angry at you for so long," she said, her voice wavering. "Angry at you for what happened. Angry at myself for letting it happen. I don't know if I can just forgive you." The admission was harder than she had expected, each word a weight on her chest. She had never spoken her anger out loud before, had never allowed herself to confront the full depth of the hurt he had caused her. For so long, she had buried it, kept it hidden behind walls of indifference and self-protection. But now, with him standing so close, the truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered. Lucas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I know," he said softly, "and I don't blame you. I don't expect forgiveness, not right away, not after everything I've done. But I want to try. I want to fix it." His words hit her like a wave, both soothing and overwhelming. He had always been good with words, with promises that felt genuine and full of hope. But could he really fix what had been broken? Could either of them? Amelia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the answer. She had wanted this moment for so long, had dreamed of it when the nights were too long, when the memories of their time together felt like distant stars in a dark sky. But now that it was real, now that they were standing here, it didn't feel as simple as she had imagined. "I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the turbulence inside her. "I don't know if we can just go back to how things were." Lucas nodded, his eyes soft with regret. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I want to be a part of your life again. I want to see if we can rebuild, if we can find something new between us. Something better." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her heart aching with the weight of it all. She had never stopped loving him, not really. But the years of distance, the betrayal, and the hurt had changed her, had made her someone she wasn't sure he could recognize anymore. She wasn't the same person who had fallen in love with him all those years ago. And neither was he. "I don't know if I'm the same person you remember either," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've changed, Lucas. I've learned to live without you. I've learned to move forward." The words stung as they left her lips, but they were the truth. She had spent so many years trying to convince herself that she could move on, that she could build a life without him. And for a while, she had. She had found happiness in small things, in the people who had supported her, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to just be. But now, with him standing here, all of those carefully built walls seemed to be crumbling, and she wasn't sure how to rebuild them. "I don't want you to change who you are for me," Lucas said, his voice earnest. "I want to know the person you've become. I want to be a part of your life, in whatever way you'll allow me to be. I don't expect it to be easy. Hell, I don't even know if we're meant to be together. But I want the chance to find out." Amelia closed her eyes for a moment, the words settling over her like a heavy fog. She had spent so much time trying to protect herself from the pain, trying to move forward without looking back. But what if the answer wasn't about moving on, about leaving him behind? What if the answer was about finding a way to let go of the past and start something new, something that was uniquely theirs? When she opened her eyes again, she met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to try." A small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of Lucas's mouth, and for the first time in a long while, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope spark within her. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. As they continued their walk through the wet streets, the city around them felt less imposing, less distant. The world still seemed broken, in its own way, but for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt like she might be able to find her place in it again. With Lucas, with herself, whatever that looked like. For now, that was enough. Chapter 11. The Secret in the Final Painting. Amelia woke to the quiet hum of the city outside her window, the soft light of dawn spilling across the floor in golden streaks. It was a still morning, one that carried a sense of peace, as though the world had taken a collective breath and held it, waiting. She sat up slowly, the weight of the night before lingering in her chest. Lucas, the words they had shared, the promises they had made, had they meant anything, or were they just fleeting moments in a long history of complicated emotions? She hadn't been able to answer that last night, and now, in the quiet of the early morning, the question seemed even harder to face. Her mind kept circling back to his words, to the weight of his gaze when he said he wanted to be a part of her life again, to rebuild, to start something new. The hope in his voice had been genuine, but was it enough to overcome the damage of the past? Amelia stood, running a hand through her messy hair as she moved toward the window. The city was alive outside, people hurrying to work, the usual bustle of life continuing on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The air felt charged now, heavy with the possibility of what might be. And yet, it also felt fragile, like a delicate thread that might snap if pulled too hard. She had told herself, over and over, that she could move on, that she could live a life without him. But there had always been this quiet ache, a void that no amount of time or distance could fill. And now, standing at the edge of something new with Lucas, she was faced with the question of whether to step forward into the unknown or retreat back into the safety of the life she had built without him. The sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand interrupted her thoughts. She reached for it, surprised to see Lucas's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat, the anticipation and uncertainty rushing back in an instant. She answered the call, her voice hesitant. "Hello? Amelia." His voice came through the line, warm and familiar, yet laced with an unfamiliar urgency. "Hey, I just wanted to check in, See how you're feeling this morning." She took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over her. "I'm okay," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Just thinking about everything." "I know," he replied softly. "I'm doing the same. I just wanted to make sure that I'm not rushing you into something. I don't want to make you feel like you have to decide right away. Take your time." Amelia leaned against the window frame, looking out at the city below. The soft light of the morning made everything seem possible, the world stretching out before her like a blank canvas. And yet, the uncertainty of what came next gnawed at her. "I don't know what to say, Lucas," she admitted. "I don't know how to handle this. All of this." "I get it," he said quickly. "You don't have to have all the answers. I'm not asking you to fix everything overnight. I just want to be here for whatever you need, even if that's space, even if that's nothing at all." She felt a knot in her throat tighten. His words were kind, but there was something almost too selfless in them, as if he had already accepted that he might lose her again before they had even really started. The thought made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm not sure what I need, Lucas," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that I need to figure this out. I need to understand where I'm going with you, with myself." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Amelia thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice steady and reassuring. "Take your time. No rush. I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his words settled over her like a blanket, soft and comforting. And yet, beneath it, she felt the weight of the unspoken promise hanging between them. He was offering her something rare, something that felt like a lifeline. But what if she wasn't ready to take it? What if she couldn't? "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I need some time." "I understand," he replied, his tone gentle. "I'll be here when you're ready." The call ended, and Amelia stood there, her phone still pressed to her ear, even though the line had gone silent. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with all of this, with the promises, the uncertainty, and the emotions that swirled within her. What did it mean to rebuild a relationship that had been shattered? Could it even be done? She set her phone down on the nightstand and walked toward the small kitchen, the motion automatic. As she made herself a cup of coffee, the weight of the day ahead pressed down on her. The future was full of possibilities, but it was also filled with questions. Questions that she wasn't sure how to answer. The door to her apartment clicked open a few moments later, and Amelia turned to see her best friend, Jenna, standing in the doorway, an expression of concern on her face. "Hey," Jenna said, her voice soft. "I thought I'd come by and check on you. I know things have been complicated." Amelia forced a smile, setting her coffee cup down. "Yeah, you could say that." Jenna stepped further into the apartment, glancing around before settling her gaze on Amelia. "How are you feeling about everything? About Lucas?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. But Jenna had always been the one who knew her best, who understood the complexities of her heart in ways no one else did. "I don't know, Jen," she said finally, her voice filled with quiet frustration. "Part of me wants to just walk away, to forget everything. But another part of me, I don't know. I don't want to lose him again, but I don't know if I can trust him. Not after everything that happened." Jenna nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's not easy. You don't have to make a decision right away, but you also shouldn't ignore how you feel. Whatever happens, you need to be true to yourself." Amelia felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to just feel it. The confusion, the hope, the fear, all of it crashing down on her in a single moment. She had spent so long trying to keep it together, trying to make sense of everything. But maybe, just maybe, it was okay not to have all the answers. "Not yet. I don't know what I'm doing, Jen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm going to figure it out." Jenna reached over and squeezed her hand, offering her a reassuring smile. "You will. And I'll be here for you, no matter what." Amelia nodded, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in this moment, with Jenna by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could find her way through the uncertainty. Chapter 12. A Race Against Time. The days that followed were a blur. Amelia had kept herself busy, finding solace in the familiar routines that had kept her grounded for so long. She worked, met up with friends, and even tried a new recipe for dinner, though her heart wasn't fully in it. Despite the distraction, the thoughts of Lucas lingered at the edges of her mind, as persistent as the low hum of a song she couldn't quite remember. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything, about the weight of choices and the uncertain road that lay ahead. She had avoided seeing him in person after that phone call. The uncertainty of their situation felt too raw, too tender to confront face to face just yet. But the quiet moments were harder to escape, those brief pauses between activities when her thoughts would settle on him, on the promises that were both comforting and terrifying. That morning, the sky was overcast, clouds heavy and thick with the promise of rain. Amelia had left the apartment early, needing space to think, needing time to herself. She found herself in a quiet corner of the coffee shop she frequented, sitting by the window, watching the world go by as the steam from her cup curled into the cool air. Her phone buzzed on the table, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw Lucas's name. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the message. He had been patient with her, more than patient, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that every second of their silence was a thread slowly unraveling between them. With a quiet sigh, she tapped on the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the message. "Amelia, I just wanted to say I've been thinking about you. I'm not trying to rush anything, but I miss you. I miss us. When you're ready, I'd like to talk. I'll be here." The words were simple, but they carried with them a weight she could feel deep in her chest. She had never realized how much she had missed him, how much she had missed the version of herself that had existed when they had been together, the version of herself that had laughed more, loved more, believed in the possibility of forever. But forever was a dangerous thing to believe in, wasn't it? Especially after everything that had happened. She hesitated for a long time, letting the phone rest in her lap as she took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness grounding her in the present. Was she ready to open that door again? Was she ready to let him back in? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door chime, the soft jingle echoing through the room as a figure walked in, shaking the rain from their umbrella. Amelia looked up instinctively, the motion so automatic that she hadn't even thought to stop herself. And then, there he was. Lucas. He hadn't seen her yet, his back to her as he made his way toward the counter to order a drink. But it didn't matter. Her heart had already started to race, and the air felt suddenly too thick, too charged. What was she supposed to do now? The world outside seemed to blur, the murmur of voices and the clink of cups fading into the background. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them together in this moment, the very moment when she had been trying to avoid the weight of the decision that had been pressing on her heart for days. Was this fate, or was it just a coincidence? Lucas turned then, his eyes meeting hers across the room. For a split second, there was nothing else. No past, no hurt, just the undeniable pull between them. The way his lips curved into a tentative smile, the way his eyes softened as they lingered on her. And just like that, the flood of emotions she had been trying to contain broke free. It wasn't just about the man standing before her. It was about the possibility of who they could be together, of who she could be with him. It was about the fact that they had once shared something that had been so real, so undeniable, and even though it had been broken, it was still there, waiting for them to reach out and take it again. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, and before she could think better of it, she was walking toward him. He hadn't moved, his eyes following her every step as she made her way to his side. The air between them felt thick now, charged with so many unsaid things. She could feel the weight of it all, their history, their mistakes, the promises they had made and broken. "Hi," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Lucas's expression softened, and for a moment, it was as if nothing had changed. "Hey," he replied, his voice just as soft. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't either," she admitted, her lips curving into a smile that felt more natural than she had expected. It was small, tentative, but it was something. "But I guess I needed to." Lucas nodded, his eyes searching her face as though trying to read what was in her heart. "I've been thinking a lot about you. About us." Amelia's heart tightened at his words, a familiar ache rising in her chest. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly, but in that moment, she knew exactly what he meant. She had been thinking about them too, about the possibility, the risk, the chance to rebuild something that had been broken. "I've been thinking about us too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm still not sure. I'm not sure where this is going, but I don't want to let go of what we had." The words came out easier than she had expected, like a confession she had been holding on to for far too long. The truth of it, raw and unfiltered, was both terrifying and freeing. Lucas's eyes softened, his hand reaching out slowly, as if testing the waters. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch light but filled with meaning. "I don't want to let go either," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for everything right now, Amelia. I'm just asking for a chance to rebuild, to try again." She closed her eyes for a moment, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. Could she do this? Could she truly open her heart to him again, knowing the risk, knowing the possibility of being hurt once more? But in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, something inside her shifted. There was no going back. Not anymore. She had spent so long holding herself back, building walls around her heart, and now, with him here, with him asking for a chance, the idea of living a life without him felt impossible. "I'm scared," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice undeniable. "I'm scared of what might happen, of what we might lose again." Lucas stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But maybe we can be scared together." The words settled between them like a fragile promise, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, about the possibility of building something new, even if it was messy and uncertain. Amelia took a deep breath, her heart racing, and with that breath, she made a decision. It wasn't about having all the answers or knowing what would come next. It was about trusting herself, trusting him, and trusting that sometimes the most difficult things were worth fighting for. "I'm willing to try," she said softly, "but we have to take it one step at a time." Lucas's face broke into a smile, relief flooding his features. "One step at a time," he echoed, his voice filled with hope. And in that moment, with the weight of the world still hanging in the air, Amelia knew that this was only the beginning. Chapter 13. The Night We Almost Missed. The days after their conversation at the coffee shop felt like walking through fog. There was clarity, but it was blurred, like a half-remembered dream that had yet to fully solidify. Amelia had agreed to try again, to see where things might go with Lucas, but it wasn't as simple as just starting fresh. The weight of everything that had come before them still lingered, hanging in the air like the remnants of a storm. They began to ease back into each other's lives, cautiously at first. like two people who were unsure of the ground they stood on. There were small moments, dinners out, casual walks in the park, laughter shared over mundane things. But there was always an unspoken understanding that things were still fragile, that they were both trying to figure out how to rebuild something that had been lost. Amelia had always been the kind of person who took her time with matters of the heart. She wasn't one to rush into things, especially when it came to trust. And though Lucas's presence brought comfort, it also brought a quiet storm of doubt, a whispering voice in the back of her mind that asked whether they were making the right choice. Lucas, on the other hand, was more open with his feelings. He had always worn his heart on his sleeve, unafraid to express what he wanted, what he hoped for. And now, in this new version of their relationship, his sincerity was both a balm and a burden. Amelia could see it in his eyes. The longing, the hope, the desire to reclaim what they had once had. But what if it wasn't enough? What if love, no matter how pure, couldn't undo the past? One evening, after a quiet dinner at a small restaurant they used to frequent, they found themselves walking along the river, the cool breeze carrying the scent of salt water and earth. The city lights shimmered on the water's surface, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost like nothing had ever changed. Amelia glanced over at Lucas as they walked side by side, his hand brushing against hers. She had missed the way his touch felt, soft, reassuring, like a reminder that there was still warmth in a world that sometimes felt cold. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the sound of the river. "About what?" Lucas asked, his tone light, but with a hint of curiosity. She hesitated before answering, the words feeling heavier now, as though they carried more weight than they ever had before. "About us. About how easy it is to pretend like everything is fine. But I don't know if it really is." Lucas stopped walking, turning to face her. The intensity in his gaze sent a shiver through her, and for a moment, she wondered if he had read her mind. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to have everything figured out right now." Amelia met his gaze, her heart heavy with the complexity of what they were navigating. "I want to believe that," she said, "but I also don't want to make the same mistakes again. I can't just pretend like everything's okay when it's not. I need to know that we're both in this for the right reasons." Lucas nodded slowly, as though he understood. "We're both carrying a lot of baggage," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "But that doesn't mean we can't move forward. We just have to be honest with each other. And with ourselves." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She knew he was right. They couldn't ignore the past, couldn't pretend that everything was perfect. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward, to build something new from the ruins of what had been. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air between them. Amelia felt her breath catch in her throat as the reality of their situation hit her all over again. There was so much they needed to work through, so much they needed to say. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe it was possible. Maybe they could find a way back to each other. "I don't know how we'll do it," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I want to try. I want to see where this could go." Lucas's face softened, his eyes brightening with something that looked like hope. Real hope, not just the kind of hope that was clung to out of desperation. "Me too," he said, his voice steady. "One step at a time, right?" Amelia smiled, the edges of her lips pulling up in a way that felt more natural than it had in days. "One step at a time," she echoed, her heart fluttering with a mix of uncertainty and excitement. But even as she said the words, a part of her remained guarded, unsure of what those steps would lead to. Could they truly start over? Could they build something new, something stronger, from the broken pieces of their past? As they continued walking along the river, hand in hand, Amelia's thoughts drifted to the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the uncertainty was what made it worth pursuing. The following week, they found themselves spending more time together, carving out moments in between their busy lives. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, unspoken doubts lingering in the air. But they kept moving forward, slowly, carefully, as if testing the waters before diving back in fully. One afternoon, Amelia found herself at the bookstore, her usual refuge from the world. She was lost in a new novel, her mind swirling with the story as the words on the page blurred together, when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, startled, only to find Lucas standing there, a small, almost sheepish grin on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice light, but there was a glint of something else in his eyes, something that made Amelia's heart skip a beat. "Hi," she replied, her smile softening. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he said, his voice teasing. "Figured you might be here, lost in a book." Amelia laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. It was a relief, that laugh, to feel something light and easy between them again. "Well, you found me," she said, raising an eyebrow playfully. "What now?" Lucas's grin widened, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Now, I'm going to take you somewhere." She felt a spark of curiosity as he took her hand and led her out of the bookstore, a feeling of anticipation stirring deep within her. They walked together through the city streets, the noise and the rush of people fading into the background as they moved with purpose, as if they were the only two people in the world. When they reached their destination, Amelia found herself standing in front of a small art gallery, the soft glow of the lights inside casting a warm, inviting glow onto the sidewalk. "What is this?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Lucas shrugged, his smile still present, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "Something I thought you might like. Something new." Amelia's heart fluttered, a mix of surprise and gratitude washing over her. She hadn't expected this thoughtful gesture, this small but significant attempt to connect, to show her that he was trying in his own way. They stepped inside, and as they wandered through the quiet halls, surrounded by art that spoke to something deep inside her, Amelia realized that this moment, this connection, this new path they were walking, was the beginning of something. What that something was, she couldn't yet say. But it was there, beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. And maybe that was enough for now. Chapter 14. The Last Wish Upon a Star. It was late evening when Amelia received the call. The soft glow of the apartment was comforting, almost familiar. As she sat curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, the warmth of the steam swirling up around her. The rain outside pattered gently against the window, and the city lights shimmered in the distance, casting a blanket of gold over the skyline. It had been a quiet night, one of those rare evenings when everything felt peaceful, uncomplicated. But then the call came. Her phone buzzed once, a sharp sound that cut through the tranquility. She picked it up, expecting to see the usual messages from her friends or the occasional work-related email, but when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Lucas. She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the phone, uncertainty gnawing at her. They had been navigating this fragile space between them, neither too close nor too distant, but always cautious. The weight of their past still hung heavy in the air, and every interaction, every conversation, felt like a careful dance of words, both of them afraid to make the wrong move. Taking a deep breath, she answered, trying to steady the sudden rush of emotions that swelled within her. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, but steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lucas's voice came through, laced with something she couldn't quite place. An urgency, a quiet tremor. Amelia, he began, his tone hesitant. I need to talk to you. Can we meet? There's something I've been thinking about, and I don't know how to say this over the phone. Her pulse quickened, and a knot tightened in her chest. Of course, she said, her voice calm despite the flutter of anxiety. Where do you want to meet? He gave her the name of a small bar on the edge of town, a place they had frequented a few times early on in their relationship. It felt like ages ago, like someone else's life, but the familiarity of it stirred something in her. A sense of nostalgia, perhaps, or the recognition that they were both clinging to something old, something that felt safe, even if it was slowly slipping through their fingers. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she replied, her mind racing as she hung up the phone. She didn't know what to expect. Lucas's voice had been different, almost strained. It wasn't like him to sound so uncertain, so on edge. She felt a strange mixture of curiosity and dread settle over her as she grabbed her coat, slipping into the familiar motions of preparing to leave, though her thoughts were far from clear. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place that felt like a secret, a hidden corner of the city where time seemed to slow down. The hum of conversation filled the air, and the clink of glasses created a soft rhythm in the background. As Amelia walked through the door, she scanned the room, her gaze landing on the figure sitting at the far corner of the bar. Lucas. He was facing away from her, a glass of whiskey in hand, his shoulders slumped slightly as if weighed down by something invisible. He didn't turn when she approached, but there was a subtle shift in the air as though he knew she was there, as though the very presence of her was a question he had been waiting for. She sat down across from him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them felt vast, like an ocean with no shore in sight. Amelia studied him carefully, her eyes tracing the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers gripped the glass. Lucas, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. What's going on? He met her gaze then, his eyes dark and full of something she couldn't quite decipher. There was a storm behind them, a conflict that seemed to be battling for dominance. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, he sighed deeply, as though whatever he was about to say had been building up for a long time, and now, in this moment, it had finally reached the point of no return. I've been thinking, he began, his voice low, steady, but filled with a weight that made Amelia's chest tighten. About us, about everything. And I realized, I've been holding back, not just from you, but from myself too. There's something I need to tell you, something I've been afraid to admit. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but the gravity of his words had already set her nerves on edge. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to steady the growing panic that was building inside her. What is it? She asked, her voice barely audible, her heart thumping in her throat. Lucas's gaze softened for a moment, his eyes searching her face as though he were trying to find the right words, the right way to explain the storm inside him. I've been scared, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Scared of losing you, scared of making the wrong move. But most of all, I've been scared that what we had, what we were, might never come back. And I didn't know how to handle that. I still don't. Amelia swallowed, her throat tight with the weight of his confession. He was scared. She had never thought of it that way, never fully realized the depth of the fear that had held him back all this time. It was as though the walls they had been building between each other were constructed from the same material: fear, uncertainty, and the pain of the past. I don't want to lose you either, she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. But I don't know if we can just go back to what we were before. We can't pretend like everything's okay when it's not. Lucas's eyes flickered with something. Regret, perhaps, or a quiet understanding. He set his glass down on the table, the amber liquid swirling gently inside the tumbler, and looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I don't want to go back to what we were before," he said, his voice firm now. "I want to build something new with you. Something better. Something that's real. But I need you to trust me again, Amelia. I need you to let me in." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her and leaving her breathless. She had wanted this. She had longed for it, the chance to rebuild, to find a way back to each other. But trust was a fragile thing, a delicate thread that could snap at the slightest misstep. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered, the vulnerability of her words leaving her exposed. "Not fully. Not yet." Lucas didn't flinch. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before it gently brushed against hers. The contact was light, tentative, but it was enough to send a jolt of warmth through her. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I'll keep trying, Amelia. Every single day, I'll keep trying, because I believe in us. I believe in what we can be, even if it's not perfect." Amelia closed her eyes for a moment, the words sinking deep into her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready to trust him again, but as she sat there, feeling the weight of his hand against hers, something shifted inside her. There was no clear answer, no promise of an easy path. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the uncertainty, the struggle, was part of what made it real. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes, one step at a time." Lucas's face softened, relief flooding his features. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes bright with a quiet, hopeful intensity. "One step at a time," he repeated, and for the first time in a long while, Amelia felt like maybe they could find their way back to each other. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but as they sat there, hands clasped together, the world outside seemed a little less daunting. Because in that moment, they had found something real, something worth fighting for. Chapter 15. Forever, under the same sky. The morning light spilled into the apartment, casting soft shadows against the walls as Amelia stood by the window, gazing out at the city below. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of decisions she had made, of promises half-spoken, and of a future that was still unfolding in ways she couldn't fully grasp. There was a quiet tension in the air, a subtle shift in the world around her, as if everything was on the verge of something profound, something she couldn't yet define. Her fingers absently traced the rim of the coffee cup in her hands, the steam rising in delicate spirals. The familiar sound of traffic drifted up from the street below, but it felt distant, muffled, as though the world outside had taken a step back, leaving her in a small, still pocket of time where the possibilities seemed endless. She could hear the quiet hum of the shower running from the bathroom, the sound a reminder of the night before. Lucas was still here, still a part of this new, uncertain chapter they were writing together. It hadn't been easy, this reconciliation, but there was something undeniable about the way they had found each other again. Something real in the way they had chosen to step into the unknown side by side. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. They had their moments of hesitation, their doubts that crept in when the silence grew too heavy, when the weight of their past threatened to pull them under. But there was also something else, something that felt like the beginning of something new, a foundation being built from the pieces they had left. Amelia let out a slow breath, her thoughts drifting back to the conversation from the night before. The words they had shared, the way they had both acknowledged the cracks in their relationship, but also the way they had chosen to rebuild from them, had been the turning point. It was a delicate balance, a dance of trust and vulnerability, and yet, despite the fear that still lingered, she felt a cautious hope rising within her. Morning, Lucas's voice interrupted her thoughts, warm and familiar, as he stepped out of the bathroom, toweling his hair dry. He was wearing nothing but a pair of jeans, his skin still damp from the shower, and for a moment, Amelia forgot to breathe. There was something about him, something so effortlessly magnetic, that made her heart skip a beat every time she looked at him. She turned to face him, offering a soft smile as he walked over to her. His eyes, still sleepy but full of affection, met hers, and for a brief moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. All the questions, all the uncertainty about what lay ahead, seemed to fade in that instant. "Morning," she replied, her voice a little quieter than usual, but no less sincere. She placed the coffee cup down on the kitchen counter and moved toward him, feeling the pull of the familiar warmth between them. As his arms enveloped her, she allowed herself to sink into the moment, to let go of the tension that had built up in her chest over the past few days. "How are you feeling?" Lucas asked, his voice low, his hands gently resting on her back. Amelia took a moment to breathe, to center herself before responding. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft. I think I'm feeling hopeful. A little scared, too, but hopeful." "Scared of what?" he asked, his fingers brushing against her hair, sending a warm shiver down her spine. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "Scared of getting hurt again, I guess. Scared of making the wrong choices. But also, I don't know, I feel like we're on the edge of something new. Something we didn't expect, but maybe it's exactly what we need." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said quietly, "but I think we've already made the biggest choice we can. We're here. We're both still here." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled over her like a comforting blanket. They had both made the choice to show up, to face the past and the uncertainty of the future together. It wasn't about pretending that everything was fixed, but rather about acknowledging the messiness of it all and choosing to navigate it as partners, as equals. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're here." He kissed her forehead gently, the tender touch sending a ripple of warmth through her. As his lips lingered there, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the quiet intimacy of the moment. The way their breaths synced, the way their hearts seemed to beat in unison. When he pulled away, he gave her a teasing smile. "You know, I was thinking we should get out of here today. Go somewhere. Take a break from all the chaos in our heads." Amelia raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Where are you thinking?" "I don't know," he said with a shrug, his playful expression never wavering. "Somewhere we can just be. Maybe the coast? I know a little spot up north. Not too far, but far enough to feel like we're escaping." The idea settled into her mind, and despite the lingering doubts, she felt a spark of excitement flicker inside her. The thought of leaving behind the weight of their routine, the constant pull of responsibilities and expectations, was incredibly tempting. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice quieter now, uncertain but intrigued. "I mean, we've got things to do, you know? I've got work in." Lucas cut her off with a soft finger against her lips, his eyes full of mischief. "Let's forget about work for one day. One day, Amelia. I think we deserve that." And in that moment, she realized he was right. One day wouldn't change everything, but it could change something. It could give them the space to breathe, to reconnect in ways they hadn't yet allowed themselves to do. It was a small step, but it was a step toward something new. She smiled, her heart lightening in her chest. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." The drive up the coast was nothing short of magical. The further they went, the more the weight of the city and its demands seemed to melt away, leaving behind only the hum of the car's engine and the vastness of the ocean stretching out beside them. Amelia leaned against the window, her fingers tracing the cool glass as the landscape shifted from urban to rural, from concrete to green, until all that remained was the open road and the endless sky above them. Lucas drove in silence for a while, his hand resting comfortably on the wheel, his gaze focused ahead. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable but rather companionable, like two people who had been together long enough to know that sometimes words weren't necessary. Eventually, they arrived at a small, quiet inn by the sea. The salt air filled their lungs, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore serving as a soothing backdrop to the serene atmosphere. They checked in, then walked down to the beach, the sand soft beneath their feet as they made their way to the water's edge. For the first time in a long while, Amelia felt a sense of peace settle over her. No expectations, no worries. Just the present moment, shared with the person who, despite everything, had never stopped being a part of her story. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and endless, just like the future that lay ahead, uncertain, but full of possibilities. And in that moment, with Lucas by her side, Amelia felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe the future didn't need to be perfect. Maybe it just needed to be theirs.